I will say actually a few words about election things. Just to do some reflection. But the thing that I would start it with though is that this class isn't about everyday politics and day-to-day stuff like that. So that's its own thing. But it is about theorizing, and my response to anything in my life like this is, geez, I need to do more theorizing. I need to do more thinking. I need to understand the world as it is and as I want it to be, and that's fine. And so I need theory to do that. That's not a bad thing necessarily, even if events are not as I thought they would be or as I wish they would be, so on and so forth. It's like I'm not here to obviously air my own personal politics, although I'm sure they come in here and there, and that's not really what I'm going to do right now either. But I will just, say at least that it's the conversation we'll have today about cultural studies is certainly going to be relevant. They are going, like, the rise of cultural studies is basically like it's 1970s, and all that the long history of the left has delivered some good things, but it certainly didn't deliver, again, whatever we want to call communism or like a radically flourishing world in which everyone's happy and kind of achieving all their capabilities as such. Okay, so the needle was moved towards somewhat of a better world, but by the 60s, there's a lot of there's certainly a lot of good social change, but there's also what we might say a lot like loss of momentum and direction. And cultural studies is the rise in which, in some sense, just like everyday culture fills that gap. And now I think that's the world we live in, where we often just turn to our own cultural interests, and just leave it at that. We have lost any sense that there would be other projects beyond that. So anyways, we'll come to that in just a minute, but the thing that I guess pondering the most out of this election is that are my theories good enough in the sense that maybe the right has a better theory about reality. That's the crisis I'm going through. Okay, go ahead.
I had to because I was thinking the same thing all of last night, and I knew this all be presented later.
Yeah.
I knew that I was presenting the day after the election.
Yeah.
And I had kind of prediction that I knew this topic goes really well with what we all just witnessed, and sometimes I do wonder if right-wing movements do have a better read on how to wield the media environment.
They have a better media theory.
They have a totally better media theory, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's no accident that Elon Musk runs X. I mean.
So it's just really,
maybe they have, they're theorists too, in their own way, in their own versions. They theorize the world, and they have their responses to it. And even actually Elon Musk does read some theory. I know some of the theories he's read.
Cool.
And this guy named Nick Bostrom, it's someone I work on a lot too. And Nick Bostrom is not an idiot. He's certainly a very smart person. So these people read books. Some of them. I sadly think that, I need to, it's always a good thing for me to learn other people's theories, regardless of my own, preferences. I was reading in here, I don't know why, I think I ran into the topic 2 or 3 times randomly in the last week or two, and I was reading even just before this election, I was reading Friedrich Hayek is this famous, very conservative, also we might call a neoliberal economic theorist, who was much championed by the right. And his argument, but he comes out of the same era as everyone who's post-war, and wondering what's left of the world, and how do you theorize after basically what seemed like the end of the world? And his argument was a free market capitalism, it will, and also meritocracy. And this sounds like someone like Elon Musk, where it's although he had a third thing, which is interestingly lost a little bit more and more, which is just that he also believed in democracy. that sort of democratic institutions, like so everyone can vote and so on, but like free choice, free market democracy, the market chooses, like based on, what people buy and so on, and that becomes value as such, values and value as such, and the government doesn't tell you what to believe in, or what to choose, or how to behave, or something like that. The government leaves you alone, and this is essentially a model of like prosperity is really the only thing we do. We just make ourselves prosperous, and there's a lot that's attractive in that model. I mean, I'm not the first person to say that in the obvious way. I mean, it pretty much is the reality as we know it today. That's a better theory of the contemporary than a lot of like the, let's say, very creatively, interesting left theory that we even encounter in our texts. That like Hayek thing can explain a lot about how existing society works. So I don't put that down. And like what it just reminds me of is that like prosperity it's really important to people. That's just obvious. And the thing I worry about is the English department and the theories that I like, are they selling they're not trying to get rid of prosperity. That would be stupid. Like nobody wants that. I mean, that's Marx. Marx is like, yes, I want prosperity, but in a really prosperous way. Like not an alienated false prosperousness or false consciousness, but like true prosperity. So he never is giving up on that word. But I could see why other people think of prosperity as it's about my prosperity. It's not about collective prosperity. It's not about collective sort of access to that good thing, good place, or something like that. It's about what I can do to make myself prosperous, and that's pretty much what one prefers. Then you add in some of these other complications, like why authoritarian populism now? Do we need the extra, the sort of people would use words like hatefulness, aggression, stigmatization, sort of intensification of conflicts that the right likes to use. Do we need that? Is that important? Some people even think that Trump would have won handily without all that stuff. That's the one thing that actually loses him votes, is all that bad vibes that he spills out and so on. You can decide if you think that's the case or not. But I get why that package is looking really good to some people. And the job of theory is always to understand that package and also to say, well, what's the alternative? And I still, I do, it is an interesting package. I still think that what theory offers is the following, and I will defend it. It's just, we can make the world just a little bit better. That's a good argument. Make the world better-ism is what I will call my argument. That's basically what Marx is saying. That's what Judith Butler is saying. That's what Stuart Hall is saying. They're all saying we can do a little bit better, folks. We don't need, constant violence. We don't need constant inequality. We don't need, constant precarity. We can do a little bit better. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll become perfect, post-communist angels or anything like that. But I think that is still the best argument. It should win over prosperity for me. It should be better. Because I would be like, okay, that's an interesting argument, but does that really make the world better? It may not, and if it doesn't, then that's not that compelling of an argument. So I think the English department does believe in that. I would say that in my notes I put in, make the world better, as I said, make people a little less shitty, the world a little less shitty, and we can do that, and that's a good argument. That should win people's things, because anybody can identify with that. you know, there are other arguments in the left tradition that I think are easy wins, like even from Marx. Marx was all about, hey, we want to maximize free time. But you know, it's weird that that gets lost in that whole tradition, right? And is that what Russian communism was about? Like, or you know, so on and so forth. Like, it did get lost, and they wanted to reduce the working hour. Today, I think you can make the case that work never stops. Like, just someone wrote a book called like 24/7. That's what capitalism is, and essentially, you know, it's monetizing you from the second you get up to the second you go to bed, like, or in bed, because now you can buy that ring, right, and monetize your sleep. Like, capitalism is just has you on it 24/7, and there's some appeal of something like Marxism, and I would say ego theory, and I would certainly say like sort of things like like various identity traditions. All these traditions have a sense that free time is good, and that it's something to fight for, and so that's an easy win in my sense, in my view of things, and. So, yeah, I mean, I think these are all ways of doing better theory, to win these arguments. Ways of doing better theory. Last thing the other has dawned on me is that, I mean, I work in environmental criticism, and we'll have a section on that soon enough. The thing I worry about that, I mean, that's the big loser in this, that's for sure. Okay, that goes out the window right away in this situation. And what I worry is that it's hard to do environmental thinking without some sense of apocalyptic rhetoric. But we've already, like, I've been in the field for I don't know 20 years, and I would say like we kind of played the card too much. We played the apocalyptic card too much, and it was like, well, if you didn't vote for environment 10 years ago, the world would end. And the world didn't end. And look, it's 20 degrees outside today. Right? Now that is a problem. Like that's not actually a good thing, but it doesn't. It's not the end. It doesn't feel apocalyptic. It feels the opposite. Now, wait for the summer, or wait for the flood, or what like. There's certainly it's present, but I get that. It does like. It's not great theorizing to play that card over and over again. So in the case with Trump, the fascist card was played over and over again. I don't really think it's fascism, but it does help us to theorize better what is fascism and what is today's version of whatever authoritarian populism is. Also, by the way, like Hannah Arendt was this interesting theorist who really whose star has shot up in the last several years, and one reason is because Arendt was just like you have to protect and stabilize democratic institutions like voting or the justice system or just the right to have rights is one of her famous lines. And this was her biggest thought after World War II. And she was in the same circle of people like Hayek and others. And they were like, no, markets will do that and we'll be fine. And her version was, it was just like, don't destroy, whatever government you have, just don't destroy it. That was her version of what to do in a terrible situation. Just, if government can function, then that's already a very, very good place. And then obviously the problem with that is that we have seen people just chip away at that or smash away at that in the last 4 to 8 years. So that was a important thing that everyone got educated on, is to return to the devotion of building and defending democratic practices. But it's not something that wins votes. Like, I know that it was a big Kamala Harris platform thing. We're voting for democracy and so on, but it's too abstract in reality on a day-to-day basis. Prosperity is not. Everybody wants to be prosperous. And so I'm not going to blame anyone for that. I get it. There's no point in blaming anyone for that. I want to be prosperous too. I just think that, I would say it has very little to do with money and has a lot to do with other things. And the great news that in the English department, theory is a form of prosperity. Art is a form of prosperity. Enjoying your day is a form of prosperity. Taking a walk is a form of prosperity. So these forms of radical prosperity that are right there for the taking, and I think they make a better case than just a bunch of money and a lot of sort of screaming and yelling. Okay, anyways, that's my little speech there. But beyond that, I just say, like, I think I just say I'll work harder. I'll theorize better. I will think more about it, and I'll keep doing my work. And I think that's a good thing to say and to teach, that we can all just keep at what we do and what we think about, and continue to sort of build those skills. Okay, with that, we can now turn it over to our first reading of the day, which is going to be guided by Nick.
Can I just say one comment?
Yeah, go for it.
Because when you brought up free time, I remember last summer I went on like this whole binge of like reading, like there's a whole study on this, like leisure studies.
Yeah.
I was reading about like free time maximization theories.
Okay.
And in one of the books, I forget what the title was, but it just pointed out the etymology of the word school, which of course we're inside of right now, is the ancient Greek word skole, which translates to leisure.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Hopefully we can
very good.
Or even if we feel like we're working too
hard,
or maybe free time. So.
Yeah, well, just to add to that little mini theorizing moment, that makes total sense. Like, you see it in Socrates and Plato. It's all about, like, wait, we don't have to run, like, it's not about, the economic. They're like, we're going to take a break and do philosophizing. It was this radical thing that you would take a break from, essentially politics, economics, all things that were called necessity, and so you would just
and study the liberal arts.
Yeah, you would enjoy yourself and talk in these, and that was the invention of theory, I would call it.
Yeah. Anyways, okay, so
all right.
I'll just get into it. So my reading was obviously the culture industry. So the three core ideas I'll overview are the notion of sameness and standardization, the logic and technological propagation of this sameness and standardization, and finally the concepts of amusement and advertising. So a core observation for thinkers like Adorno and Horkheimer is that the unprecedented increase in the forces of production in modernity in the West had yielded an effect opposite from that anticipated by Marx in his original writings. Rather than being an explosive force conducted to revolution, as forecasted by Marx, the expansion of technology in the service of capitalist industrial production had culminated in social and political oppression on a scale never before seen. This level of technological expansion and its marriage to capital deeply impact the origination and propagation of everything we may refer to as, quote, culture. Adorno and Horkheimer make the succinct observation that the genesis of components of culture are, in modernity, themselves standardized moments and occurrences of cultural production, much like the production of any other commodity. Divorced from historical notions of art, cultural production, as we know it, is a process totally administrative in complexion. The mechanized work process of daily life, which occupies a realm previously identifiable as separate from things like artistic consumption and leisure, is no longer any different in structure from pursuits of actual and genuine leisure and cultural endeavor and cultural enlightenment. Instead, these cultural spaces of daily life, those formerly known as escapes from power and forces of industrial capitalist production, are subsumed into one singular, totalizing form of production, and thus prolong capitalism's existence by ultimately strengthening it from the inside. In the culture industry, thus, you have all facets of the political and economic spectrum, side by side, only distinguishable by minor elements of their content and aesthetic, while their form, structure, and reason for existence, like every other entity in the culture industry, remains the same. In this sense, even the most radically different ideas or cultural artifacts become reproducible and reproduced such that their relation to the broader political and economic system render them more or less the same but different. So it's this same but different phenomenon that brings me to the first idea from the text that I'd like to get into, which is the notion of sameness and standardization that they talk about. So Adorno and Horkheimer are very good at pointing out ways in which modernity and technological advancements have contradicted historical Marxist predictions about capitalism's end. As the theorists declare in their opening sentences, despite the decline of objectively established religion, the dissolution of the last remnants of pre-capitalism, together with technological and social differentiation or specialization, this has not resulted, as might be expected, in, quote, cultural chaos. Instead, culture as we know it is more consolidated and uniform than ever. Quote, culture now impresses the same stamp on everything. Films, radio, and magazines make up a system which is uniform as a whole and in every part. The cultural industry's characteristics of ubiquity, the way it can occupy the consciousness of the public all at once in both the background and foreground of all other forms of production that occur as parts of everyday life, is exemplary of this standardizing power in action. Take what we may consider as facets of art and culture today as largely accessible through digital means. The interaction between ourselves and culture is usually less of a contemplative and progressive process, but rather a consumptive and stagnating process that is often only capable of producing reproduction and nothing massively meaningful or different. Consuming culture, or quote, content as we're more familiar with it as today, can itself feel almost as exhausting and draining as a full-time job. In this sense, it is only the logical conclusion of the culture industry to produce phenomenons we know today, like the influencer or content creator. Titles like these give name to what feels like is already the case anyways. You may as well turn this content thing into a career. Now, it is important to reaffirm that the standardization and sameness that Adorno and Horkheimer describe does not argue that everything, every stitch of culture is literally the same, but rather that there is the sameness and standardization in the construction, arrangement, and distribution of culture across all different genres, modes, and forms previously known. The process of standardization and producing sameness is obviously central to what we can think of as the culture industry. Where prior to Adorno and Horkheimer, notions of standardization were once originally derived from the needs of consumers, this relationship has now been flipped. With the proliferation of the culture industry, we see standardization as a primary objective for the creation of needs and desired goods, instead of a mechanism of merely sorting and the already existing needs and desires of the public. In this sense, the culture industry is a highly imperative system. It is not the result of technology itself, but the way in which large owners of capital seize and weaponize technological systems to command outcomes that are entirely one-way in nature. And they also maintain a convincing veneer of participation and control held on part of the system, on part of the citizen. Think of the former method of standardization that has historically been known as a large fishing net cast into the ocean to collect and sort multiple species of fish. This itself is a standardizing act, whereas the form of standardization operating in the culture industry is more akin to aquatic farming practices, where fish are born captured and born pre-sorted. Much like the way artifacts and attributes of culture are absent of any stark variations today and can rather be interchangeable with one another in a fashion that best serves the schema they operate within, in this case capitalism. So the second idea I want to focus on is technology's relationship to the propagation of this sameness and standardization and the logic behind this process. At the time of writing their essay, Adorno and Horkheimer were observing Western societies that were of course experiencing this unprecedented boom in technology and media, like films, radio, and magazines. Now, Adorno and Horkheimer make it clear that the culture industry is, quote, not a result not of a law of movement in technology as such, but its function in today's economy. The logic and technological propagation of sameness and standardization can be identified by acknowledging the way that new technologies disallow for active participation. On this notion, Adorno and Horkheimer write, quote, the need which might resist central control has already been suppressed by the control of the individual consciousness. The step from the telephone to the radio has clearly distinguished the roles. The former is still allowed the subscriber to play the role of subject and was liberal. The latter is democratic. It turns all participants into listeners and authoritatively subjects them to broadcast programs which are all exactly the same. Here it becomes increasingly clear how sameness and standardization propagates because the modern technological apparatus and mediums of cultural dissemination grant the culture industry the ability to authoritatively regress the public into passive listeners of the same fundamental messages, only received by different channels, stations, or outlets to, again, keep up that veneer of difference. In this sense, something is provided for everyone such that no one can escape or even feel an itching to escape in the first place. This muting of genuine occurrences of escape, or any inklings of spontaneity, highlights another key element of the logic underlying the culture industry's proliferation of standardization. Where previously cultural works of art prevailed for their ability to capture uniqueness and therefore elicit spontaneous responses and outcomes from public onlookers who are interacting with these works, the culture industry snatches spontaneity and literally incorporates it into the whole as merely a minor technical effect. As Adorno and Horkheimer write, quote, everyone is supposed to behave spontaneously according to a level determined by indices, and to select a category of mass product manufactured for their type. On the charts of research organizations, indistinguishable from those of political propaganda, consumers are divided up as statistical material into red, green, and blue areas according to an example income group. In this sense, all genuine agency is removed from the individual in a process that has occurred and is occurring behind the scenes. Today we experience this most notably through forms of social media, where we may gain an awareness of the, quote, algorithms that control our content. While one may go out and explore new forms of culture, or new content that is, it is increasingly hard to escape the bounds of predetermination and have a truly authentic, raw experience. This fragmentation of historical notions of art and the subsequent redistribution of these new old fragments lead Adorno and Horkheimer to exclaim, quote, the so-called leading idea is a filing compartment, which creates order, not connections. Lacking both contrast and relatedness, the whole and the detail look alike. This notion of seamlessly blending the products of culture with all other elements of everyday life underpins the technological logic of the culture industry. Its aim is to feel natural and thus unquestionable. To quote from the essay again, such is the industry's ideal of naturalness. It asserts itself more imperiously the more the perfected technology reduces the tension between the culture product and everyday existence. Just as nature compels humans, animals, and the environment to embody certain behavioral patterns, the culture industry brings with it a feeling that gently and subtly compels individuals to comply with its desire for further sameness and standardization, because individuals and the consumers that they are rendered to become ultimately serve as integral agents and components to the technical apparatus of the culture industry proliferating. As history shows us, a sign of any successful or advanced technology is its ability to increasingly seamlessly integrate into life as possible. The triumph of the culture industry is its ability to propagate itself not through force, but having the deceived masses do so willingly by having their minds quite literally made up for them before they even have to think twice. Adorno and Horkheimer write, quote, under the private monopoly of culture tyranny does indeed leave the body free and sets to work directly on the soul. The ruler no longer says, either you think as I do or you die. He says, you are free not to think as I do. Your life, your property, all that you shall keep. But from this day on, you will be a stranger among us. So anyone who does not conform is condemned to an economic impotence which is prolonged in the intellectual powerlessness of the eccentric loner. Disconnected from the mainstream, he is easily convicted of inadequacy, end quote. I found this passage really fascinating because it brings to mind the modern phenomenon of, and maybe you can all relate to this, when you're in a public setting and everyone around you either has headphones in or browsing their phone or laptop. You may arrive in the situation walking the bus, boarding it, or even walking into class. In this moment, everyone is aboard the culture train, and that voice inside your head tells you, you're totally strange right now for not participating, is enough social pressure to compel you to hop on board and start consuming that culture. That leads me to my third idea. So the third idea I want to focus on is the way that Adorno and Horkheimer portray and delineate the experience of amusement and advertising and their cyclical effects within the culture industry that keeps people coming back for that sweet, sweet deception. The theorists claim that programming that appears in modern media is manufactured and managed by, quote, special experts, and their, quote, slim variety is specifically tailored. The separation of programming into different channels or flavors of the day, it grants the users or citizen a feeling of control. In reality, herein lies a form of the culture industry's mass deception, as all channels and their content are ultimately produced with, as I've explained, the same standardized capitalistic motives that strive to continuously perfect its own illusion in perpetuity. Or in other words, keep you watching, keep you engaged, keep you entertained, and ultimately keep you amused. Because standardization and producing sameness lend so well to fostering sensations of amusement in the individual, standardized cultural artifacts or products become no more than, quote, the after images of the work process itself. Thus, for the culture industry, the effect of amusement on the individual and their perception plays an integral role in deceiving the masses and further blurring the lines between cultural enlightenment and mere cultural production, which we more usually experience. By eliciting amusement in the public, culture can more efficiently become advertisement and therefore serve capitalist interests more effectively. On this, Adorno and Horkheimer write, quote, amusement itself becomes an ideal, taking the place of the higher values it eradicates from the masses by repeating them in an even more stereotyped form than the advertising slogans paid for by private interests. And they go on to say, quote, culture is a paradoxical commodity. It is so completely subject to the law of exchange that it is no longer exchanged. It is so blindly equated with use that it can no longer be used. For this reason, it merges with the advertising. Take statements like these in our modern context. Can you confidently spot differences between culture and art and advertisements or pitches to sell you something? Does spotting this difference even matter in the first place? Adorno and Horkheimer expand on advertising in the culture industry with the following. Quote, in a competitive society, advertising performs a social service in orienting the buyer in the market, facilitating choice, and helping the more efficient but unknown supplier to find customers. It did not merely cost labor time, but saved it. Today, when the free market is coming to an end, those in control of the system are entrenching themselves in advertising. It strengthens the bond which shackles consumers to the big combines. End quote. As an industry, culture has been co-opted by and for capital, such that it facilitates its continuation by promoting promotion, advertising, and selling. It manufactures needs where there are no needs present. Where in the past advertisements created efficiency, today technological efficiency creates advertisements. With the industry being so efficient, cyclicality and mass deception is inevitable. New choices spring up, new aesthetics, new trends, but participation in any of the culture industry's new flavors, while it may feel good and very well be quite problematic in many instances, only one thing can consistently be true of these acts of participation, which is capital is served and strengthened, and your participation will most likely be marked and accounted for the purposes of the industry's next calibrations. As Adorno and Horkheimer write, through the language they speak, the customers make their own contribution to culture as advertising. End quote. Thus, as individuals continuously get swept up in the tide of the culture industry's notions of commercially infected amusement, we draw closer to the inescapability of capitalism's grip on life and unimpeded manifestations of culture. Ultimately, participating in the deception of the culture industry's amusement firmly blocks the path to what Adorno and Horkheimer would call genuine enlightenment. And so that's it for, I have 3 questions.
Okay.
I can go on to those.
Yeah, okay. Go quickly, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So quickly, like very broad, does it matter if lines between culture and commerce are blurred? What does the culture industry do well for a society? What is the difference between culture and content?
Okay. All right, thank you. Good. Okay, very good here. All right, so we'll pick up some of those questions in a sec here. I just was going to point out that it's almost easy to forget how much sort of, let's say, the inflation of culture took place at a certain historical moment. And there's no real date for this, but I'll just throw out like 1850s. Like if you go back, before that, culture might have been a small thing in people's lives, whether that be reading a novel or the newspaper or listening to an opera or whatever. It would not have, it would have been a rare occurrence in their daily experience, unless you were highly educated or had special access to this or something like that. And then compare that to like right around 1850, all this stuff becomes much more accessible to everybody and becomes much more present in the world. In that sense, culture really takes off. Culture becomes a real thing people do and have and spend time on and has, like, let's say, historical force. And that's the real, like prior to that, what had historical force? Maybe it was technology, maybe it was modes of production, as Marx would say, maybe it was national power, maybe it was imperialism, whatever. These were the large sort of forces, historical forces happening at the time. Suddenly around 1850, culture takes up as big a force in history, making history. It just happens right around the time of Marx, and Marx is doing his work on capital, and it's interesting. Like, does he hold out kind of an aesthetics as the opposite of capital? Doesn't really know, where culture and art fit in this whole picture. He has he does like certain works of art. Sometimes that he'll say he's like, Milton is like, let's compare Milton to earth or silkworms. They both produce at a certain rate or something like that. It's a weird analogy. that he offers, that some here and there around what the role of art as sort of producing might be. That's like, let's say 1850s. By the time of this text, which is right after World War II, but it's essentially written during like wartime. Horkheimer and Adorno were Germans who fled Germany during the war, ended up in Los Angeles. I don't know if you've ever been to Los Angeles. It's glorious. And somehow they hated it. I can't remember. Oh, I think it's in. Oh no, it's in a different blurb. It's like for Jean Baudrillard, but it's in this book, and I was just reading it recently. And Baudrillard was like, the worst thing about Los Angeles is just, it's not just the fact of everyday life and capitalism. It's that people actually like it. That would be Adorno and Horkheimer's like, nightmare, because it's like, well, this is really, in their view, just the lowest of what culture can offer or provide. It's all like these movies, this music, and this stuff is not particularly, let's say, as artful as it should be, in his view. It's just essentially bad art, and yet it's very popular. So, like I said, we have the rise of culture as a historical force, let's say 1850s, but by 1950s almost, it is increasingly a culture, let's say, a historical power, but not because the art is any good. I mean, quite the opposite, as Nick was saying, was showing us, is that the artwork is becoming standardized and reductivist and just perpetuates essentially capitalist values, which, fine, if art does that, that's one thing, but does all art have to do that all the time? That's what art is becoming in Horkheimer and Adorno's view. So anyways, I just point that out because, last thing about Marx, since we especially did that last week, is that Marx had this model what some people think is for sure Marx is saying, but you can make an argument in various ways, but this thing called the base and the superstructure. The base, again, is modes of production, the sort of arrangement of social relations, if they're feudal or if they're capitalist or if there are other forms of modes of production and so on, that will shape all of the cultural kind of activity that goes in those modes of production. So that's the base superstructure model. So culture is on top. True politics, true history is made by, let's say, materiality that is worked by the modes of production. Okay, and so art really is only at the top in the superstructure. It never really affects the base. Today, nobody believes that anymore. This is essentially the rise of cultural studies, to say that model is just too fixed and it doesn't really explain the role of culture as such, and we need to have that explanation. We need to theorize that. So here we go with with Horkheimer and Adorno and Nick's excellent presentation. If I just can add a couple things here. They are fascinating writers, very, very catchy. They are interesting readers of the aesthetic. Adorno goes on to write a lot of fascinating work on the nuances of the aesthetic. Here, they have a tendency to sort of argue that, as we see on 1037, style itself is being caricatured, as he says. That's the sentence itself. It says on 1037, no, this caricature of style reveals something about the genuine style of the past. The concept of a genuine style, that would be like true culture or good art, becomes transparent in the culture industry as the aesthetic equivalent of power. So art used to, even in Kant's model, or have some distance from, you might say, purpose or political power, or trying to sort of be, immediately relevant. Art might have wanted or preferred some of that sort of autonomy, we might call it, but now in the culture industry, it doesn't need that anymore. Its style is to be directly relevant to the middle class, the middle class consumer. It doesn't want distance from capitalism. It wants to be part of it wants to be capitalized. So art doesn't want distance from everyday social life now. Whereas, even you could say, I don't know, Beethoven, Mozart, or Goethe, or, these are a little bit of caricatures, but are they really wanting distance from everyday life? Not exactly, but they don't just want to be the flavor of the moment, as Nick was pointing out. But art in the 1940s and so does want to be flavor of the moment. That's because, hey, you can marketize that pretty well and make the money and move on. And one doesn't have to aspire to anything more than that. Just sellable art. And so style now shows that. So you can see it at the level of sentences, I would say, or at the level of the visuality of a film, or at the level of narrative, film narrative, or at the level of art, visual art or something like that. Okay, I will. Just to build on what Nick was saying, why would art want to do that? In large part is because everyone seems to accepted the routines of working reality. Everyone is ready to just fit themselves into the capitalist system and figure it out from there. We see on 1038, he says only by, this is at the end of that long paragraph, 1038, only by subordinating all branches of intellectual production equally to the single purpose of imposing on the senses of human beings from the time they leave the factory in the evening to the time they clock in the morning, the imprint of the work routine, which they must sustain throughout the day, does this culture mockingly fulfill the notion of a unified culture, which the philosophers of individual personality held out against mass culture. Maybe I'll pause there and ask you, more of it as a dialogue, okay, what are Horkheimer and Adorno saying that art is doing now in this 1940s, 50s era that's maybe different than previous role of art? Just based on that. Go ahead, Sarah.
Basically that it's manufacturing a sense of inescapability, right? So if you go home and what you can watch on TV or read in a book or hear on the radio is all like a reproduction of your work life, then there is no sense that there's something outside of the system that you're currently in.
Yeah. Or if it doesn't reproduce it even at the level of content, it's reproducing at the level of form, like showing you that there's nothing else to listen to. As Nick said, you have no choice. Pick one of these stations, but they're all the same. They're all run by radio stations that are trying to make money. Or today, pick one of these social media platforms, but they're all trying to algorithmatize, all of your social existence. The particular content, you might have more pleasure in this show or that show, but what we call today the platform is standardized in that way, and it just reproduces the sense that that's what social life is. It's be captured by a platform and monetize it. That's what everyone's objective today seems to be. Find your platform and make money out of it. And the art is just reconfirming that. And so it's interesting. It's a very fascinating observation that art just perpetuates that, whether at the level of style or content, or whether at the level of form. Okay. All right, I think we've got, and then Nick said that, technology shows us this too, based on the limits of choice, or the fact that it takes, they talk about the studio system in the film industry and how it's very expensive to make a film, so that's going to lead to essentially films that make money. And we saw that today. So so technology and the capitalization of it shapes the style of what is being produced culturally. You might say the same thing with art in a museum. A museum is very expensive. It can be expensive to make art. On the other hand, it can be very free. Like, you can make art right now, for no money, or and there's something still liberating about that. So that didn't ever go away. But you might just on the flip side say, but if you want to succeed and really make money, back to that capitalist system of where only big productions are going to work anymore. All right, so I think we've got enough of issues of style, issues of this integration with everyday work systems, issues of technology. So the obvious question is there any way out of this? And I think it's partly some of the questions that Nick was asking at the end there. What do Adorno and Horkheimer say about that? Not much. He says that, okay, at the very bottom of 1041, says what is decisive today is no longer Puritanism, though it still asserts itself in the form of women's organizations, but the necessity inherent in the system of never releasing its grip on the consumer, not for a moment allowing him or her to suspect that resistance is possible. It sounds like he's answering our question for us, but let's keep going. The principle requires that while all needs should be presented to individuals as capable of fulfillment by the culture industry, they should be so set up in advance that individuals experience themselves through their needs only as eternal consumers, as the culture industry's object. I'm just going to skip a little bit more at the end. The culture industry presents that same everyday world as paradise. Escape, like elopement, is destined from the first to lead back to its starting point. Entertainment fosters the resignation which it seeks to forget itself in entertainment. Okay, so what's going on here? Is there any escape to this, I would call it an acceleration of standardization, technology, platforms, the work system, capitalist system, and culture? What's going on here in their view or in your view?
It kind of feels like the culture industry builds into itself the means of escape, which just brings you back into it.
Yeah.
So, like, the only way to sort of combat it would be to not escape it. But then if you're not escaping it, then you're just a part of it.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. So we're caught in a lot of binds. I don't know exactly. I wouldn't call them exactly double binds, and partly they are in a way. But I do like that first point you're saying. It's like, oh, tired of the same old stuff from culture industry? How about some culture? It's basically saying, click this instead, and you're right back into that system, or are you? All right, Dakota?
Yeah, I was just thinking of the classic Apple commercial.
Yeah.
That was like parodying 1984. It's kind of that, right? Where it's like your freedom from IBM is buying an Apple computer, which is like you end up in the same cycle, but you have that comforting feeling of having liberation. Yeah. Well,
Apple perfected the idea. It was a slight. I put it in my notes when Nick, you were presenting it, which is sort of like, I do think there's a small variation where Horkheimer and Adorno emphasized all the sameness that you highlighted. That this was sort of, you were stuck constantly with essentially the same plots, the same types in film. Strong hero male figure and like save woman who needs to be saved and so on and so forth. Now we have all forms of difference, and Apple perfected that as saying like this will unleash your creative difference. So, but difference takes the place of that sameness to reproduce you reinvesting in that essentially culture industry or that work system or capital system, or the capital culture relationship. So while maybe the style has changed, the way that style integrates into the system has not. Tina, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. And I want to say that this escape hatch is the new word that he uses. He calls it like the situation is unescapable for the consumer. How do you define consumer? Am I a consumer?
Yeah.
And if I am, to what extent I am a consumer? If we can answer those questions, we might come to a solution.
Okay, so resisting consumption, or not identifying as the consumer, or questioning the.
Well, we cannot be. It's impossible not to be a consumer.
Yeah.
To what extent we are.
Yeah, or at least let's say minimizing the role of consumption in our life. I think if I was thinking back on our periodizing with Frederick Jameson last week, and I think I didn't fully understand even for myself that one of his arguments is that he calls postmodernism the logic of late capitalism, but another word for that is just it's like the rise of consumer culture. So to the degree that we can understand the rise of culture as like fairly recent thing, 1850s, okay, but then suddenly it became the rise of consumer culture, which is a little different than culture. And that dominates now. That's essentially what they're describing. And what postmodernism is, consumer has all the choice. But as long as you keep consuming. And the question is there a way of dislocating that? Not identifying with consumption, still while appreciating art, but not appreciating the consumer system that it is reproducing over and over again. That seems to be the big question. And to the degree that we're still in postmodernism, some people, even I myself said I think we're out of it. But I should put with caveat that I don't think we certainly haven't left the consumer mode of production. That is the marketplace. It was in the 1970s and 80s, and that was a big change. And it's still the dominant, let's say, mode of. It's almost the silly thing is like Marx calls it mode of production. We should call it mode of consumption. Like the consumption is the mode of production. And if that's the paradigm, then that's called postmodernism. Okay, and then the question is, well, should we push against that? All right, so Daniel and then Vincent.
Yeah, I was gonna sort of, maybe I shouldn't, but it's just what's on my mind.
Okay.
But extending Dakota's analogy of the Apple commercial, and like, I think we can also think about culture and consumption and being presented with that new that escape route, that free option in the recent political affairs of yesterday, like and just right wing, like two-party system, like right wing, left wing politics, like pendulum swings, constantly back and forth. Exactly. So it's like you said, like, are you part of this culture? You don't want that anymore. Here's a new. This is going to save you. Like we're going to axe the tax, as Paul Revere says. And and then we'll go with that for a while, and then it'll say, "Oh, here's some new culture."
Yeah, or it'll just go like this back and forth. It's like it's a sort of bending dialectic.
And it just kind of bounces. And like I think that's Trump's just like he's old culture as he was when he sort of arrived, but like he's new culture in that he is old, and it's like playing on this nostalgic culture.
And Jameson was Jameson called that nostalgia for the present. Where we constantly don't feel like we have any real access to living our present, so we just fill it with these versions of nostalgia. The one that he points out he loves in postmodernism is Star Wars. He calls that like it's not a future, it's a sort of nostalgia plot. And Trump feels that well too. MAGA is a certain nostalgia plot that fills meaning for people because they're bored and exhausted by that stupid, incremental reality that everyone faces. And Adorno and Horkheimer see it too. We're all stuck with that. They're stuck with it too. The right is stuck with it too, by the way. Their answer is also a version of like incremental correction. I mean, like it's not. I don't think it's very impressive given the arguments in our theories that we were trying to say is like we don't want to do incrementalism anymore. We want a big life change, which would really give us that free time to do art or to theorize or whatever. And that's not ever out there. Even like what would it be if the Democratic Party said, like, actually we're just for free time. That's it. Like working hour is 2 hours, then you're done. Like, but I mean it's almost stupid, but at least it would be such a different thing. Jameson, I'll just point out one last thing, which is that Jameson said, like, okay, let's think of real radical change. And his was full employment. Everyone's guaranteed a job. So given how we are all obsessed with prosperity, it's like almost like, okay, let's just structurally make it sure that everyone is like minimally prosperous. And then actually maybe we can do things like leisure and culture and art and so on. And to me, that's also called the universal basic income. I mean, it's still not off the table, that idea. Who knows? All right, Vincent.
Love thinking about the financial.
Jump in there too if you want.
In terms of like Apple ads and poor taste, they had one that got a lot of backlash where it was like
hydraulic press.
Yeah.
This giant hydraulic press with like a bunch of like art supplies, and then it goes down and crushes everything, and it comes up as like the iPad, and they're like, it's like the new form of art, and everyone's like, okay. Like just kind of like the consolidation of everything into like that.
Yeah.
Like they're like, oh, like look at all these different options,
Yeah.
all these things you can just an iPad.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was so, and they present it as such like a positive thing.
Yeah.
And I think the backlash to it kind of represents that like breaking away from that like being stuck in that, what is the word? Like the standardization of everything, like being stuck in that idea of like, oh, like everything's on this one device, but like people react and they're like, no, like actually like these other art forms are still valuable even if they're less efficient.
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, there's a perfect image of the culture industry, the smishing of culture into the industrial object that is the iPad, and that this is now the cultural object. It's culture industry perfectly blended together for you, as long as you keep buying their products. And and it's not it just doesn't satisfy as culture usually, or whereas writing your own poem or reading, a kid's poem, you don't need the iPad for that. It's pretty damn radical, I always think. So, Julia, and then a couple of other,
like you just said, like satisfying, the overall feeling that I kind of get when we're having this conversation and stuff is like a general like dissatisfaction, just about consuming in general, like the act of it. But I think I'm thinking about in terms of like content. If I'm dissatisfied with something, even if it's like, my artistic practice, or I don't know how to like write a sentence, there's always something I can consume to help me with this. Like there's tips that I can consume. There's information that I can consume. So I think there's no way to get out of that in the artistic process, because like learning has then been like wrapped into this like process of like making
consuming
art. So I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You can monetize your writer's block. So, I mean, or just like AI will essentially monetize. Like, you need to write that paper, theory class, whatever it is, we'll monetize it for you. And and there's nothing more. I mean, and also the AI produces very standardized works. It's almost like the perfect mean, like of all the diverse theory that's been out there, and we'll pick the exact sort of the most kind of most probable argument that Adorno would have made. So it is pure standardization in that sense, large language models. So it just keeps, they definitely caught on to something. They caught on to basically how culture, the rise of culture was one thing, and then the hooking of that into the industrial capitalist system was another thing. And then it just doesn't stop. And then that becomes history, just more culture. Like the culture industry producing more culture, and then that's the whole story of history, and no one can escape it, because where are you going to go? So, all right, Sarah.
Well, where are you going to go, I think, is like one of the main questions, right?
Yeah.
Like even when you ask yourself, like, what can you do to be less of a consumer, or to like break yourself, like, as an individual away from like a cycle of like entertainment that feeds you back into the cycle. It's like you can like radically disconnect if you really want to. It's like an individual possible action. But like the problem's also really structural, right? Like an individual person radically disconnecting doesn't make a huge difference. You'd have to convince everyone to radically disconnect to like interrupt the system. So it's either you can convince everyone to radically disconnect, in which case you're probably not actually doing it. There's probably the disconnection is probably not happening, right? Or like something underneath it has to like collapse, and you don't really know what it is that like supports it, that is vulnerable to collapse.
I don't think, I think the ship has sailed, and I don't think we're getting out of the culture industry yet. In our lifetimes. No. And so I don't know what that means for all of us, but I don't know if it like. And here and there we do have our own moments of dropout. There's no doubt, and our own disconnect, and that's a good thing. We can preserve that. But well, all right. Just keep going. We'll keep going. There's a few thoughts. Go ahead, Maya.
I think one of the things that also makes the cultural industry so strong is like Adorno and Horkheimer say that it's a psychological tool. And I think one of the things that it offers is instant gratification.
Yeah.
And I think that even more so now when you've got platforms like Netflix and Amazon Prime and Disney Plus. And so then at the end of the day, you're trying to unwind and then you're asking what is going to give me the most instant gratification that is free from my day. And that might be, I think for a lot of people, including me, is just to put on a show.
I know. I do the same thing.
Yeah, and so like to consume.
Yeah, even when I'm disconnecting.
Yeah. So it kind of it plays on that need for instant gratification because even with I know a lot of people say that kids these days don't read. Well, there's a reason.
Yeah.
And that's because you're taught that you don't really have to work in order to consume content.
Yeah.
And reading is a process that takes some investment.
Yeah.
Whereas putting on something on your iPad and just letting it run in the background and you mindlessly watch. So it also hooks you in with where do I need to exert the least amount of work. And then it becomes like a reward for getting through the day.
Yeah. You just described all my kids' daily life. And my life too. I mean, right? We're all stuck.
And you're also you're coming away from working within a society that is capitalist, even in the university. We discussed this last week as well. How this itself it's an institution because you pay for tuition, you pay for books, you pay for all sorts of things, and so then you go from one function of capitalism to another function of capitalism.
Yeah. Well, as a follow-up, I want to ask, as we always trying to theorize the English department, is the English department the way out? Are we the exception? We are the culture industry, or we're the way out of the culture industry? Because we don't make money. We're not Apple. We're not, we're also not, or we're not Hollywood cinema here, or Netflix. We're not these giant platforms. We have a really weird relationship to culture, but that's the point. We don't really want a culture industry yet, do we? So maybe we're in a different boat. Julia? Kelly?
Kelly,
you can go first.
I was just gonna kind of say I think it's fun for us to be this sucks, but I think we're in the room because of the cultural products that
that hooked us.
That hooked us, and I'm even thinking because I do a lot of work with illustrated novels. I'm trying to think of the consumption of affect in the novels very easily absorbed through the picture, right? You can see the person feeling the things. So in a way that is supplemental content. But then how can I sit here and be critical of that, even though I find that super interesting and it's the basis of my research?
I know, exactly,
yeah. So
we're always that's culture industry, but my stuff is much better than that.
Where do you draw the line between? Is it nicheness or is it just internet? Is it the digital stuff that because it's so close to us that we find?
And then the additional irony was that all that the culture industry was already in the stuff that we like. Pick whatever you like, it's in there. Or this great line from Adorno. Okay, so the artist's autonomy was only merely tolerated. This is in 1048 in bottom in 1049. The artist's autonomy was only merely tolerated and has throughout bourgeois history been connected to what he calls a moment of untruth, which has culminated in now the social liquidation of art. The mortally sick Beethoven, who flung away a novel by Walter Scott with the cry, "The fellow writes for money," which is what I do in every class I'm in. I show the students, "The fellow writes for money." And then, of course, they can't resist the extra sentence, while himself proving an extremely experienced and tenacious businessman in commercializing the latest quartets. Works representing the most extreme repudiation of the market. Offers the most grandiose example of the unity of opposites of market on autonomy in bourgeois art. So even those who think, hey, I hate art for money, I like art because it's the opposite or it's my version of something that resists the culture industry. Well, the culture industry was in there. in that work. Or it stages that dialectic of autonomy and capture, and lets you do your little autonomy thing because you are in that system already anyway. It's a delicious sentence, and so on. All right, Kelly?
Yeah, to add to that, I was just thinking about the question, like, has non-standardization, like, it has always existed? Like, even, like, when you say, like, 1850s when culture arose, I don't know. But, like, pre-1850, like, people still had culture, but it might not be in the form of books or, like, literacy. It might be, like, gathering around someone telling a story, and then they would return back to work. So it always had a democratic function. And then, like, to your question, is the, like, English department, like, resistance to, like, culture industry? I would say, like, we need to think about Virginia Woolf in, like, a room of one's own. Like, to create any art, like poetry or just to come study, we need income of sorts. Like, maybe, like, a piece of paper is, like, the cheapest form of creating something, but leisure time in itself comes at a cost. Like, when you're creating art, you're also not earning money. And if we think about the 1850s, like, the people creating art were also the richest people.
But also folk life had, people who are artists without access to wealth, and so. But I wrote in my notes, Virginia Woolf, room of one's own. It's universal basic income.
Yeah, true.
So there's something to be said for that. Okay, I know we have other reading, or two last thoughts here. Go ahead, Vincent.
I was going to say, like, I think just any art that's created or written, like even in the English department, like, it's made to be read by someone. Like, it still has to be consumed to, like, have value. Like, you can write it for yourself for fun. But, like, someone else, like, usually you want someone to read.
But you're not trying to get them to read it as consumer. You want them as reader, which is different than consumer, right?
That's true, but, like, it's still like it still has to be, like, processed by another person. So I guess, like, the only solution would be to, like, flee into the woods and live a monastic life. And just make art for yourself.
Exactly. Then you're freed from consumption. It's just for you.
Well, I mean, sort of in the opposite direction is that, I don't know, I'm hung up on the idea of escaping it because it seems to me that one of the only ways that we can escape it is by leaning into it further. Like, I think about camp art and stuff like that, and that's, something that I really love. And part of the thing that I think is so interesting, and I think Nick's presentation really highlighted this, is that part of the culture industry is the idea of reproduction from something. That, like, we see this in, like, Hollywood movies, is that, like, one movie leads to another movie, which leads to another movie. They can kind of recreate these sort of forms over and over again, and they can still be consumed. But I think what's interesting about camp art specifically is that the second there's an iteration of any sort of, like, campiness, any recreation of that afterwards falls flat, doesn't work. There's not even close. Like Warhol's soup cans, for example. Any iteration of the soup cans after it has no effect.
Well, that's an interesting irony built into it, because on the one hand, it is
a recreation itself.
The style itself is the reproducibility, but then if other people reproduce the reproducibility of that style, it falls flat.
It doesn't seem to destroy the culture industry. Like, it plays into it more, but it at least seems to stop the line of logic, to halt it for a moment.
I mean that's of course part of that's postmodernism in that sense of, like, making art out of the commodity, with the commodity, not necessarily against it, not trying to do the modernist thing, which is like, we're separate from the marketplace. Now it plays with the marketplace to some extent, but it does it in an interesting way because it's not really just the pure collapse of art and commodity, and also it has this sort of signature thing, which is and queer aspect to it, and so on. So and to that extent, it might show a way to sort of kind of having the commodity, but also having the art at the same time without. Weirdly, I'll just say it's just good art. Like, that's part of the thing that pisses off Horkheimer and Adorno the most. It's like, this art just sucks. Like, they just don't like Hollywood films. They think they're poor. I don't know. Maybe they're wrong about that. Maybe some 1920s Hollywood films are really darn good. And I'm sure there was some good films here and there. Just to add to this, though, famously, Adorno hated jazz. He was completely wrong about that. Okay, you don't have to be a jazz lover to say that. It's just like, I'm sorry, he hated all jazz. He hated it. For him, it was like the way the drum is constantly beating in a jazz song forces you into a rhythm. It commands you, and this is sort of the logic of of cultural control. He hated that. He loved not being told how to consume his art, and he thought that art that forced you to control you into its consumption was tyrannical at some level. So that's why he hated all jazz. He's wrong about that. And then, of course, there's jazz that is not always just a single drum beat or so on and so forth. Of course, there's also a racial component to that. Jazz being produced by primarily African Americans. What's going on with that? And Adorno. So many people have written about that. So to the degree that there was a lot of interesting art being produced that they totally missed is one thing. But on the other hand, maybe they are still right that even jazz gets pushed back into the culture industry, regardless of how radical it seems. All right, last thought here, and then.
Just Tim's comment made me think. What trips me up is when you get like that standalone thing, or like in your example, like a campy thing, or something that feels like genuinely authentic. Then what trips me up is like I feel like the culture industry can then make a new genre of standalone things, right? So you get. Now we're big into like limited series. Artists are not doing world tours, but like doing 3 shows.
I know.
And it's like, no, that's the new replicate.
I know. Yeah. Well, also then just slap it back in our face. Andy Warhol's worth $50 million a painting. So it's like, so it was commodity after all. Like and it's not good art. That's the we're just. The cycle just keeps going, and it keeps accelerating, and keeps reinforcing itself, and that's the reality. And yeah, it's not a happy picture. Okay, before we leave behind, I just wanted to point out that as theorists. Oh, by the way, I was going to say, how do you get out of the culture industry? You theorize. That's my answer to everything. There is escape. It's called theory, and that's what Adorno and Horkheimer would have, I think, been correct with saying. They would have agreed with that. One of the ways you escape through theory is through the style of theory, and Adorno, I'll give him credit for this in particular. So it was Jameson who said this, but I really like it, and I've used it as a great, let's say, technique, I'll just call it technique, of theorizing, which is the dialectical sentence. And Jameson said all of Adorno's sentences are dialectical. And I think he's right. And so I'll just, that one that we read, the mortally sick Beethoven who flung away a Walter Scott novel with the cry the fellow writes for money, okay, that's the thesis, and then the dialectic antithesis is the next part of the sentence, while himself proving an extremely experienced and tenacious businessman. There's a dialectical tension in that very sentence. And, I don't know where it goes, other than you can sense there's a double critique in there. I'll pick another sentence. There's a very obvious one on 1048, which is the very top there. It's a sentence, it's hard, the context is a bit lost here, but anyways, it says, they come to fulfill the very individuality they destroy. Perfectly dialectical sentence. So individuality is won at the cost of destroying individuality. And he's referring to Mickey Rooney or like the pop roles that actors play, or I don't know, word pop is not the best there, but just the sort of fixed sort of mass appeal of roles in narrative film. So you get, you pick any, and this is true today, pick any Netflix show, Emily in Paris, and full of all this individuality, great individuality, right? So the individuality is won at the cost of destroying individuality, because she's just she's like a cliched character. There's nothing more cliched than American in Paris. On the Netflix platform, showing all the quirkiness, and all the the plots are very formulaic. They are written by what feels like AI, in the sense of like, oh, there's a social mix-up or a misunderstanding or so some form of rom-com like this or that, and we know what will happen and that kind of thing. So the degree that Emily in Paris wins her individuality, it's lost at the very same time into the narrative standardization and so on. So again, like I said, dialectical sentences, they're all over the place in this text, and it's just they're very good at it. And it's something I took to heart. I mean, I feel like when I read that statement by Jameson, it helped me theorize. It helped me write theory. So when I write my theory essays, I do try to do that. I try to make sure every sentence has a little bit of, let's say, dialectical tension in it, or kind of has a little bit of a like thesis argument that is not like, I don't know, is showing a little bit. It's just showing the contradictions at the level of the sentence, or in the claims of the sentence. But it can be adapted to various kinds of sentences you would use as a theorist, that you want a similar tension. These are also very direct, they're very funny, they're very smart, they're very clever, they're very theoretically strong, I would say. And so it makes for a good model of how to write a theoretical sentence. When a sentence doesn't have a little bit of dialectical tension, it feels like it's missing something. It's just false. All right, as usual, the first reading always goes longer than I want it to be, and we lose time, but it's okay. At the very least, I will do a quick commentary on this Roland Barthes reading. We're not going to spend much at all on it. I just thought it's a very short reading. It's just a nice little early example of cultural studies. And as you kind of probably would have recognized what I wanted to do with this was part of my argument of that cultural studies is also the term that we would use, our literary tools, in Barthes' case, literary semiotic tools, to close read anything. Close reading is really good at close reading poems, but close reading turns out is really good at close reading anything in the world. So it can close read plastic. It can close read, so he has a whole series of very short essays that were published, I think, in some sort of newspaper, weekly or monthly or something like that. That's why they're short. But where he would just give you his sort of semiotic take on anything in particular. There's one on like wrestling, there's one on like Romans in film, and plastic. Like, how is Barthes able to close read all of this? He's using semiotics, formalism. He's also a bit of a formalist. So he's interested in what the form of plastic is. So interestingly, it's any form you want. As he says, it's the stuff of alchemy. It's the transmutation of matter. It takes any form and any color. Although he's very clever, he close reads the color because he shows us that, especially up until recently, plastic had very distinct colors. It had like a very sort of like flat blue, or really bright orange, or so it couldn't, I don't know, it had these very distinct colors rather than, now you can make it any color, I suppose, but colors that you really don't find in nature that much. And anyways, that becomes the way he reads plastic, through these formal semiotic effects. He goes on to say plastic is a very idea of its infinite transformation. It's that anything in nature can be now, let's say, copied by plastic or fashioned via plastic. Plastic is easily enjoyable, as he says in the next paragraph. Just a few highlights, and then I'll just explain a little bit about the method in a second. Plastic no longer cares about we points out the hierarchy of substances. It used to be like gold, but not just gold, like things that had a kind of historical resonance, like stone, or wood, or water. These are all sort of materials whose materiality says a lot about the aesthetic and even social effects of these objects. So what you do with stone, you create stone culture and stone buildings and so on. Same thing with water. And well, plastic is the same thing, but it doesn't care about the hierarchy of materials anymore. It can mimic anything. And in that sense, it's a very postmodern material, as we will say. He goes on to say, plastic loves to be used. It loves to be swallowed up in the fact of being used. This is the last point on 99. Ultimately, objects will be invented for the sole pleasure of using them. So there's this throwaway culture, this consumer culture. It sounds very familiar, like as the culture industry and the way that the role plastic plays. He doesn't, he's missing many things. Plastic's made out of petroleum. So what about all role of energy and oil and all this in this story and so on. But point is that he's able to use his close reading skills to apply to plastic. Let's see. Just to say how we might think of this as an interesting early model of cultural studies. It almost has a kind of interesting like Marxist thing. It's like where you read the materiality of the thing. Materiality shapes culture. Here it's the plastic, but the materiality of plastic is a cultural production. So here we have a model in which sort of cultural objects are sort of shaping material reality, and material reality is shaping culture. And the role of the cultural theorist, the cultural studies thinker, is to look at that double shaping. He has an essay at the beginning of this book of mythologies where he theorizes what he's doing, and he says that he does a double reading. So he's interested in how the object is made and how the object is sort of positioned in a cultural system. So it's kind of I'll get it called double reading and double shaping. I don't know, double theorizing that he's doing here, and that's what cultural studies is as a method. So you do close reading on the object, and then you do sort of, I don't know if the right word is close reading, but you do cultural reading. How does this shape culture? How is culture being made through the object? So we understand the object, and we understand the culture and the cultural effects. So with this object, we understand how its status as thing, as consumer item, and then as cultural system. Plastic shapes culture. Culture itself becomes plastic. Culture is the plasticization, right? Culture is plasticized, if you will. As he says, all of life is plasticized. Your body, your heart, and so on. But the whole point is that culture itself becomes shaped by this object. So we close read the object, then we read the culture, and then we kind of connected the two and realized culture is plastic at this point. So that's basically it. that's kind of what I want to get out of this, that there was a bit of invention of cultural studies. This is from the 1950s, this essay, mid-1950s. So cultural studies doesn't exist as a field yet, but you can see Barr kind of turning it into one. He's an English professor. He's great at reading Flaubert or Marquis de Sade or Honoré de Balzac or Sarrazin. These are all French authors. He's really good at all these. Racine. He's got beautiful close reading, and then he's got plastic. And then he wrote a book on fashion, and then he wrote a book on photography, and then he wrote a book on other random things on Japan. It was probably his worst book. He went to Japan. But the point is that he realized he is such a oldish school English professor as you could think, writing essays on Racine, like a French 17th century playwright, and doing the semiotics of Racine, and is quite tedious. And then yet does the same thing on plastic, and suddenly has become the hippest new cultural studies avatar you can imagine. So it's very interesting to see the career of Roland Barthes kind of doubly inventing the core of the English department. Sort of formalism, also sort of deconstruction, semiotics. We don't really do semiotics exactly, but we'll just call it close reading of metaphors and whatnot, of narratology. He sort of crystallizes all that in his career, and then suddenly he also crystallizes cultural studies, queer theory, and he does auto theory. He wrote his own biography or autobiography called Barth on Barth. He also wrote this wonderful book called The Pleasure of the Text, where it is kind of an antidote to the culture industry, which tells you it's going to please you but never really does, and he's like, where do we really get pleasure anymore? So I just point that out because I want to say that actually the whole package of Barth is cultural studies. It's that he could close read Racine, and he also could close read plastic, and then he could sort of turn these into methods and think about them as methods. That makes him so interesting. All right, that's the Barth for now.